So we're going to be in Lamentations chapter 5, and we're actually going to finish out the book of Lamentations today and sort of finish out our series, which is kind of cool. Hopefully it's been a good series for you guys. Hopefully you've learned some about one of the lesser-known books of the Bible, even if it is a little bit tough at times. So we'll be in Lamentations chapter 5. And today's message is a little bit happier than last week. Now, if you weren't here last week and you get bored with what I'm saying now, just on your own, scroll back, on your phone or wherever to Lamentations 4. It's an awful chapter. That's what we did last week, okay? And hopefully it wasn't too bad. This week is only about half bad, and we'll look at Lamentations 5 in a minute. The author of Lamentations, most people think it's Jeremiah, is still going to struggle and still tell us some bad stuff, but at least chapter 5 is going to end on a positive note, and that's how we're going to end with the book. So the title that Chris gave to this and asked me to talk about today from Lamentations 5 is Learning to Hope. Okay, so learning to hope. Last week was learning to embrace suffering, which was really tough, but this week is learning to hope from Lamentations 5. We're going to walk through that. Let me take a minute to pray, though. I like to pray before I jump in the Word. I know several people have prayed, but it helps me to focus and such as well. So let me take a minute and pray, and then we'll be in chapter 5 of Lamentations. Father, we thank you again for the morning to meet. I thank you for each person that you brought here, whether they're friends and partners, whether they're new, or whatever their situation may be. I thank you that you have chosen to bring them here today. I thank you that you're a big and great and gracious God, and that you have hope enough for every person here today. And I thank you for that. I often feel inadequate. I have no hope to give. I can give a handshake or a smile, but I have no actual hope to give. But I pray today, God, that you would help me to point people to Jesus and point people to the hope that you extend through the gospel, through Jesus, to every person. And I thank you for that. I pray for clarity. I pray for encouragement today. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so we're going to be in Lamentations 5 here in just a couple minutes talking about learning to hope today. And as I was thinking about the book of Lamentations as a whole, I was trying to think of a good sort of metaphor for the whole, because we're down to the end, we're down to the last week of talking about Lamentations this week, and it's really hard to come up with a good metaphor for Lamentations. And if you don't believe me, try really quick. No Googling, right? Just try. Okay, 5 really sad poems about death and destruction, So I thought about maybe like a really dark album, like if you're into like screamo rock or something like that, maybe that would kind of work. And I was trying to think through this, and about the best metaphor I came up with for Lamentations would be sort of like going to a funeral. Now, if you've been to a funeral this past week, or if you've lost one recently, I'm not trying to make you emotional or make you sort of revisit that wound. But I think all of us at some point have been to a funeral, and we kind of get that. We get the idea of a funeral, that it's just tough. Even if a person had been sick for a while or was older and was sort of expected to pass away, funerals are just tough times. As much as possible, we sort of try to dress them up and give hope. Like if we attend a funeral, we try to, wear something nice, maybe something understated in colors, but we try to, wear that suit and tie if you're a guy, or a nicer dress if you're a lady, something like that. We try to have flowers in a funeral, maybe some candles. Like we sort of try to dress it up, but it's really hard to escape the fact that something bad happened. That something difficult happened, that somebody died, and that's why we're here. Now, I've been to a number of funerals. I've only ever spoken at one funeral or officiated one funeral, but I can tell you that there is much more hope, and that's where we're going to go today, at the funeral of somebody that's a Christian, somebody that has faith, than perhaps somebody that just didn't believe in God or whatever else. And again, while I'm not trying to necessarily get into philosophy of funerals and all that, I think a good metaphor for Lamentations might be, if you're somebody here today and you would know Jesus and you've been to a funeral of somebody that knows Jesus, I kind of feel like that's a good metaphor for Lamentations. It's a sad thing. Sadness has happened. And we can sort of try to dress it up in the case of Lamentations with nice poetry. We can kind of try to dress it up, but we can't escape the fact that something sad has happened. But yet, especially if we're at the funeral of a believer, for instance, we have hope that God's going to set it right. We have hope that one day that person that we're about to close the casket and drive to the graveside and see that casket go into the ground, if they know Jesus, we know Jesus, we have hope that one day, as Jesus says, he'll be the resurrection of life, and that person will come back and we'll be united again when Jesus returns, and we've got that hope. And that's really cool, but guess where we live? In between, right? And there's still rough days. Even if you know that person knew Jesus and has hope, we still miss them. We still sort of have this lingering kind of feeling, and I sort of feel like that's how Lamentations comes together. It's going to end with hope, and of course it's not exactly a funeral, but it's going to end with hope, but we kind of have this lingering kind of bittersweet kind of taste in our mouth that's anticipating something more. Or to put it another way, if Lamentations ended here and this was it, we had no new covenant written by Jeremiah, we had no New Testament, we had no Jesus, we had nothing else, it just really wouldn't quite be resolved to me. So we can talk about hope from Lamentations, but where I think we're going to have to go is we will look at Lamentations 5 and see the hope that's there, what is there. But my goal today is to get us to learn to hope, as our tagline goes, but to get us to learn to hope by focusing on God's character. But to do that, we're going to have to get to the gospel. Okay, so main idea today, and those of you guys that have heard me talk before know I kind of like to give a main idea. My main idea today is this. My main idea is that hope is a result of intentionally focusing on the character of God as revealed in the gospel. Hope is a result of intentionally focusing on the character of God as revealed in the gospel. Now, I want to sort of think through that big idea, and we will get to Lamentations 5, but I want to talk about focusing on the character of God, but focusing on the character of God as revealed in the gospel, because again, I think that's really going to matter, not just for the original audience of Lamentations, but for you and me as well. We've got to learn to focus on the character of God, even when it seems perhaps that God doesn't know what he's doing. So we've got to start there, and then we'll get to gospel. But as I was thinking about trying to get people to hope by focusing on character of somebody, I thought of something that happened not last summer, but the summer before with my younger son, Andrew. Now, if you're in kid church and you know Andrew, first of all, thank you and bless you. Andrew's an awesome kid, but Andrew's enthusiasm, Andrew has like one speed, like it's like awake and 100 miles an hour, and then he like passes out. He also does the whisper yell thing and talk yelling, and Andrew's really intense. Well, my son Andrew, he's awesome, and so is my other son Peter, but this story's about Andrew. He got a splinter, okay? Now, those of you guys and ladies that have kids, I think it's this thing that every kid struggles with, right? They get a splinter and it hurts a lot, but they don't want you to touch it if you're mom or dad, right? Because you coming at them with those metal tweezers, like they're just convinced you're gonna take out an organ or like cut their finger off. And so Andrew's there, and of course his finger's like all red, and he's screaming in pain, and I come to him like, I gotta get this out. He's like, no, don't touch it, but it hurts, and he's having this like train wreck moment. And again, a lot of you guys that may know me, I don't do real great with empathy sometimes. I'm just kind of like, man up, Andrew, give me your hand. Like, we're just going to do this, and you can scream, and you'll get tired of screaming, and, I'll give you M&Ms, we'll be fine, man. But anyway, I'm trying to talk Andrew through this, and Andrew's like, what are you going to do? I'm like, I'm going to get the splinter out. Well, how are you going to get it? I'm like, Andrew, I'm going to get the splinter out. And again, we got the splinter out, okay? It was a 20-minute or so deal, and it did end in, I think, M&Ms or something like that. It ended that way, okay? But it got down to the point where I basically had to get to the point with Andrew of, yes, I kind of half sat on him and held his hand, okay? But it got to the point as well of, basically, Andrew, do you trust me or not, right? Like, I'm your dad, I'm not perfect, first to admit that, but do you trust me to get this thing out or not, right? And at the end of the day, he's like shaking, he's like, yes, and I sit on him and get the splinter out. And we kind of laugh sometimes, but from Andrew's perspective, I'm trying to help him, and I'm trying to get him to trust me, but from his perspective, it doesn't look like I know what I'm doing. Right? I'm coming at his hurting finger with a metal object, and he's like, I don't know what's happening, and he's sort of panicking there. And I've got to get him to the point where it's basically an issue of trust. Do you trust me based on my character, although I'm not perfect, but my track record of, at that point in time, your 6 years of life, Andrew, I feel like my track record's been more up than down, and you're going to trust me or not. And we get to the point where he does. Now, we kind of laugh about that, but I think in my main idea, the first part of it, I think that's us, right? We're the kid with the splinter, and we've got to hope in God, but we've got to focus on his character and what we know of him in the past, revealed in Scripture, because there's a lot of times that we have to hope in God, but it seems like God doesn't know what he's doing. Whether, again, that's a tragedy in your life, a tragedy in somebody else's life, those times in life where bad stuff happens and it doesn't make sense and it seems like God's not there, our hope, first off, has to start with the character and nature of God. When it feels like God doesn't love us, we need to think, no, God is love. His word tells me that, and I can think back about times that God has loved me. God is love, even though right now, today in my life, God doesn't feel very loving. Or God is faithful, even though today it may not feel like that. We've got to focus on the character and nature of God. I think that's big. But then the second part of my main idea is we've got to see that through the lens of the gospel. Okay? So focus on character and nature of God to get hope, but that's got to be through the lens of the gospel. And of course, by gospel, I mean the good news of Jesus. Because that's where we see the character and nature of God most clearly come together and extended to us is in the person of Jesus Christ. Because if we are left with only the character and nature of God, minus the gospel, that's actually pretty bad news. Ever think about that? Like if we lose Jesus, if we lose gospel, we have a God that's good, but I'm not good. We have a God that's just, but I can't fix my problem. We have a God that's holy, and I'm unholy. And Jesus in the gospel is going to be that missing piece, I think, that Jeremiah's original audience here in Lamentations needed to hear in the new covenant, and that we, post-cross, post-Jesus, look back and say, I'm going to get hope from the character and nature of God, and look at how God did that in the gospel. And that's our hope. Or as the Apostle Paul says over in Ephesians, and we'll be here in Lamentations in a minute, as the Apostle Paul says over in Ephesians 2, he says, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says, you are dead in your sin, you are without God, and you are without hope. But he doesn't stop there. He says, but God, who is great in mercy, rich in love, made us alive in Jesus, and Paul goes there to give hope. Okay, so big idea today, we're learning to hope is the title, but the big idea today is that hope is a result of intentionally focusing on the character of God as revealed in the gospel. Right, we're going to be in Lamentations chapter 5. And if you've been with us through the series, some of this is going to be repeat. I'll try not to take too much time to recap. Although you probably didn't notice this, but there's no gigantic clock in the back today. So that's like a green light, right? I can just talk. No, I'm kidding. I've got to watch, and I'm sure the kid church workers would just have all the kids invade if I hit like 11:20. Okay, so I'll watch. But there's no gigantic clock today. So, but I'll keep track of the time. Anyway, my point being, we'll jump in. All right, some of this is going to be a recap, and I want to take a lot of time on this, but as we've mentioned a few times before, and we've said this the past few weeks, Lamentations, the book of Lamentations is 5 sad poems, or 5 laments, and all of the poems, with the exception of chapter 5, follow this sort of alphabetic structure. So it's in Hebrew, but I'll use English letters. It'd be like if verse 1 started with the letter A, and verse 2 with B and C, and so on. So it's got a lot of intentionality and structure. The dead center of the book, the absolute dead center of the book in chapter 3, is great is your faithfulness, and I don't think that's unintentional. So we've got that going on. So it's a series of sad poems, but chapter 5 is different. Chapter 5 breaks the pattern in that it doesn't follow the alphabetic structure. Now, people have tried to guess why that is, because it seems like with so much intentionality in the book, it doesn't seem like Jeremiah just ran out of words that started with A or something and didn't know what to do with 5. We think he's got some intentionality there, but nobody really knows for sure. Some people think you can still kind of make an acrostic out of it that says God is great, and some people think that. Other people think Jeremiah just breaks the pattern because it's a prayer, and it's supposed to feel more spontaneous, almost like when we pray. But whatever the reason or whatever the thought process may be, chapter 5 is going to be a prayer to God, and it's a prayer really for restoration. Again, historically, in context, Jerusalem, God's city, has been destroyed. The temple has been destroyed. Many people have died, suffering has happened, some people are in captivity, and it is about as bad as it can be for the Jewish people. So Jeremiah's written Lamentations, gets to chapter 5, and he's going to pour his heart out, and he's going to pray to God. Now, like I did last week, I actually want to read chapter 5 all the way through, which I realize that's a lot of verses, but try to track with me, try to get the impact of all of it, and then I really want to park at the end, okay? But I'm going to read Lamentations chapter 5. I'm going to start in verse 1. I'm going to read all the way through. Then we're going to park at the end as we think about hope, okay? So Lamentations 5, I'm going to start in verse 1. It says, Lord, remember what has happened to us. See how we have been disgraced. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our homes to foreigners. We are orphaned and fatherless. Our mothers are widowed. We have to pay for water to drink, and even firewood is expensive. Those who pursue us are at our heels. We are exhausted, but given no rest. We submitted to Egypt and Assyria to get enough food to survive. Our ancestors sinned, but they have died, and we are suffering the punishment they deserved. Slaves have now become our masters. There's no one left to rescue us. We hunt for food at the risk of our lives, for violence rules the countryside. The famine has blackened our skin as though baked in an oven. Our enemies rape the women in Jerusalem and the young girls in all the towns of Judah. Our princes are being hanged by their thumbs, and our elders are treated with contempt. Young men are led away to work at millstones, and boys stagger under heavy loads of wood. The elders no longer sit in the city gates. The young men no longer dance and sing. Joy has left our hearts. Our dancing has turned to mourning. The garlands have fallen from our heads. Weep for us because we have sinned. Our hearts are sick and heavy, and our eyes grow dim with tears. For Jerusalem is empty and desolate, a place haunted by jackals. But Lord, you remain the same forever. Your throne continues from generation to generation. Why do you continue to forget us? Why have you abandoned us for so long? Restore us, O Lord, and bring us back to you again. Give us back the joys we once had. Or have you utterly rejected us? Are you angry with us still? And that's how Lamentations 5 ends. Now, if you're sitting here and you're like, that didn't sound very hope-filled, I will give you the first part isn't. Okay, and the first part sounds a lot like chapter 4, and I'm not going to take time to necessarily go back and talk about all the different things that happened. It is interesting, though, if you look at this at chapter 5, and again, we're going to focus mainly on the end of the last few minutes I have. It starts out as a prayer, and all of it's a prayer, but it sort of shifts to this we and us language. And hopefully, whatever translation you looked at, or if you looked up on the screen, hopefully it did that. Sort of this we and us sort of corporate prayer to God for help. So it starts out that way, and then, just to paraphrase the middle part of the chapter, Jeremiah goes through and basically identifies all these different groups and essentially says everybody's suffering. Older people, younger people, royal people, not royal people, boys, everybody's suffering. But then he gets to the end, and this is where I want to park for a couple minutes on the last 3 verses to think about this idea of focusing on the character of God for hope, and then I want to get us to gospel. So we come down here to verse 19. So I want to spend a few minutes on the very end, 19 down to the end, and I want to sort of walk us through that. Because that's where it turns positive, right? It's just easier for me to preach that, right? So let's turn the positive dial here and at least get to that point. So Jeremiah corporately leading these people. He's going to come and he's going to focus on the character and nature of God in these last couple verses. But it's interesting how he does this, because it sort of alternates good and bad. Did you notice that? So for instance, if I were to pick up again in verse 19, it says, "But Lord, you remain the same forever. Your throne continues from generation to generation." That's really good, right? Yeah, good. Character and nature of God. God's good. God's in charge. But then notice sort of the reply. Why do you continue to forget us? That sounds kind of negative again. Why have you abandoned us for so long? So again, we're negative. Then he comes back positive in verse 21. Restore us, which kind of presupposes he thinks that God can and will. So it's positive again. Restore us, O Lord. Bring us back to you. Give us back the joy we once had. But then notice how the pendulum swings again, right at the end. Or have you utterly rejected us? Are you still angry with us? Is what he says. So it's interesting that even here at the end when he gives hope, we still kind of feel like this pendulum is swinging back and forth a little bit. But I think if you're like me, that mirrors life pretty well. It's not like you learn to hope one time and then you're good for the rest of your life. I mean, just think about maybe an issue you struggle with now. It's not like one day you in your time with the Lord, you're reading, you're praying, you're worshiping, you're seeking God, and you feel so encouraged about this problem today. And it's not like, okay, I was encouraged on Monday, so I'm good for the rest of my life. I'm never going to be discouraged about that problem ever again. No, I think if you're like me, and I believe you are, we see ourselves here a little bit, right? That yes, I'm encouraged, God is good, but man, is he really good? But yes, God really is good, but is he really good? Is he really good today? I know he was good yesterday, but is he good today? And we sort of struggle with this and go back and forth, and I think the tension here is real. But again, I think Jeremiah's goal here is to get the people to focus on the character and nature of God. So let's walk through it really quick, a couple teaching points, then I want to get us to gospel and application, and then we'll transition to communion. So teaching points here. How do we see Jeremiah focusing them on the character and nature of God? He says, verse 19, he says, Lord. And hopefully in your Bibles there, hopefully it's like those little capital letters. You guys know what I mean by that? It's like big capital L, but then little capital O-R-D. That's the way most Bibles signify this covenant name of God. Yahweh, Jehovah, God, okay? So he starts out and he addresses God. He could have addressed him as God or El Shaddai or one of these other names of God, but he goes back to the covenant name of God. Now, at this point in time, right when this is being written, it doesn't feel like God is keeping his covenant, right? I mean, think about some of the covenants. How about the land? We don't have that. We got overrun by Babylonians and pretty much everybody's dead. Think about the Davidic kingly line. We don't have a king right now. They took him off to Babylon. We have no king. How about things like temple? And we could go on, but it doesn't feel like God is doing that. But Jeremiah is saying, no, God is the covenant-keeping God. And again, as we'll get to in a minute, I think Jeremiah is going to sort of prod us here to new covenant. He says, but Lord, covenant-keeping God, he says, you remain the same forever. God is unchanging. Jeremiah wants him to know that. Even if some kid, let's assume you're one of the people in chapter 5, you're the boy, for instance, Jeremiah talks about struggling under the heavy load. I think Jeremiah wants that kid to know that God is the same, that God doesn't change, even though that kid's got a heavy load of wood on his back and maybe saw both of his parents die in the street. As terrible as that is, Jeremiah here is saying God doesn't change. God is the same. He says, you are, but to God, your throne continues. Again, a little bit of the irony here is the Davidic throne is not right now, not at this moment in time. So even though Israel doesn't have a king, Judah doesn't have a king, Jeremiah is saying, guys, let's focus on God's character. God still reigns. So God is the covenant God. He's the same. He doesn't change. He still reigns. Then again, the pendulum swings back a little negative with verse 20, but then coming back in verse 21, Jeremiah says, restore us, O Lord, and bring us back. And again, putting this in context, most people believe, like me, Jeremiah wrote this, and the book of Jeremiah, if you had time to go over there, has promises of restoration. It has promises of a new covenant because they couldn't keep the old one. Jeremiah says one day God's going to bring you back to the land and he's going to give you a new covenant. And this time he's going to give you a spirit inside of you to help you keep this, and he's going to restore you and bring blessing and all of those kind of things. And I think Jeremiah's got that in mind as he writes this, and I think I can just picture him sort of reading these scrolls to people in Jerusalem that are suffering, and then I can sort of visualize him after he gets through 5 being like, and hey guys, let's come over here to this other scroll I wrote, and let's read about what Jehovah God's going to do. There's going to be a new covenant. There's going to be a better one. There's going to be one that God enables you to keep. So I think Jeremiah here is turning them, and he's having them focus on the character and nature of God to give them hope. Now, it's interesting here in verse 22, he leaves us with a hanging question. And I think he sort of wants us to answer that a little bit. There's a couple Bible passages I thought of with hanging questions. You guys ever read the last verse in Jonah? You guys remember Jonah and the whale / big fish / sea monster, depending on who's telling it. Jonah, right, gets swallowed up. And guys, remember the very last line of the book is a question. Because Jonah goes outside the city of Nineveh is not destroyed. Jonah's all ticked about it, and he wants to see, fire rain down or something on Nineveh. And God leaves him with the question. He says, hey, Jonah, you're really selfish, and you get upset about trivial stuff, but shouldn't I, God, be concerned about over 100,000 people? ? Fade to black. Like, that's the end of the book of Jonah. Where I think about after Jesus calms the storm on the sea. You guys remember that story? Disciples are in the boat. They're trying to bail water. Jesus is asleep. They finally wake him up. They're, we're dying. Hey, help us, Jesus. And he stands up and he says one word, right? Peace be still is just one word. Jesus stands up, one word, sees like glass. And then we sort of get the idea that Jesus, sits down, goes back to sleep. And the disciples say, who is this guy? Right? Like what kind of guy is this? That was not normal. Like, who is this that even the winds and the sea obey him? ? Next story in the Gospels. So I think this happens in the biblical story, but I think we are left to try to answer this question both for Israel and for us. Would God abandon Israel forever? And frankly, then in our lives, does God leave us alone? The answer to both is no. To finish this out very quickly historically, and then I'll come up with some application. We know that approximately, depending on when Lamentations was written, but 70 years after the captivity happens, they get to come back. And if you want to read that this week, you could look at Ezra and Nehemiah, those books. They get to come back, rebuild the temple, and they get to come back and all of that happens. But if we were to keep fast forwarding through the biblical story, approximately 580 to 615, somewhere in that kind of ballpark range of years later, we would fast forward to somebody named Jesus of Nazareth who goes and lives and dies and rises again. But not to get ahead of myself to communion here, but Jesus says something really, really profound when he observes the Last Supper with his disciples. He takes the bread, breaks it, he takes the cup of wine, he says, this is the new covenant in my blood. Where in that moment, the character and nature of God is coming perfectly to focus. The ultimate giver of hope is right there in front of them, and he's saying, this is it, this is the new covenant. He's saying, my body broken, my blood shed, this is the new covenant, this is the fulfillment, this is the answer to Lamentations 5:22. Will God forsake us forever? No. He's going to bring us back to the land. He's going to send Jesus who brings new covenant, and that is going to show me again the character and nature of God. Is God faithful to deliver? Yes, he delivered Jesus. Does God love me? Yes, he sent Jesus. John 3:16, God loved the world and sent his son. Is God just? Yes, Jesus died for my sin. Is God holy? Yes, Jesus died to make me holy. And you can go on and on and on. But I think that's where Lamentations 5:22 goes. It goes to new covenant and to Jesus, and that today is where you and I are going to find hope. So again, main idea today, we find hope as we intentionally focus on the character and nature of God revealed in the gospel. So as we apply this today in the last couple minutes I have before we transition to communion, want to bring some application to this today. First off, I want to start with perhaps the person that's here, and you would be open about the fact perhaps that you're not a Christian, that you don't know Jesus. And if that's you, I want you to feel welcome. I don't want you to feel singled out or ostracized or anything like that. But if you're sitting here today, maybe you are, like the passage I quoted a couple minutes ago from Ephesians 2, maybe you're there and you're like, man, I'm the guy that's without God and without hope. I don't know what to do. I have train wrecked this thing. It's not working. My way's not working. I don't know what to do. I need hope. If that's you today, we have good news. We have the gospel. We have the character and nature of God, as we said, revealed in Jesus, but that is freely offered to you today. Hope is available in Jesus Christ today. So application number one, if that's you today and you'd like to talk more about that in a couple minutes when we do our communion time, there'll be a few of us, myself, probably Tim, and maybe some others will be standing in the back, and we'd love to talk to you about that today. But for those that have never found hope in Jesus, the good news of the gospel today is that it's there. Now, what about perhaps those of us that would say, you know what, I have trusted Jesus, I believed him, I found hope, but it's still a struggle. I'm on that pendulum, between verse 19 and 20, between 21 and 22. I want to believe, God, I want to believe that. I know you're good, but it doesn't feel like it. I've got a couple applications for you then. So application number one was believe the gospel. Application number two, and I've got 3 more, so 4 total. Application number 2, take some time this week to memorize one verse on hope. Take some time this week to memorize one verse on hope. If you want to stick with Lamentations, you could go with a verse like, for instance, Lamentations 5:19. But Lord, you remain the same forever. Your throne continues from generation to generation. Maybe you want to flip back to chapter 3, to the dead center of the book, and go with, great is your faithfulness. Or perhaps you'd pick another verse, and you can sit there, you can go to a Bible website or something and search for hope, and you have hundreds of hits. But take some time this week to memorize one verse on hope. Do that individually, do that with a friend, do that with your spouse, do that with your kids. Memorize one verse on hope, and I think what you'll find is you start thinking about it and incorporating it into your mind, it gives hope. It sort of connects that way. Take some time to memorize one verse on hope this week. Third application, 2 more and I'm done here, real quick. This is going to sound like a school teacher, that's what I am, but this is going to sound a little school teachery, but try to stay with me. Take some time to study the character of God this week. And I realize you're like, that sounds like homework. We hate homework. We finished college, so we don't have to do that anymore. Okay, I get that. But take some time to study the character of God this week. Now, that doesn't mean that all of you have to go over to Lifeway and find the biggest, most boring-looking, gigantic theology book you can. Okay, you don't necessarily have to do that. If that's you, knock yourself out. Go for it. But take some time to actually focus on the character and nature of God this week. Because if what I'm suggesting is true, that hope comes as I study God's character in the gospel, if you sort of walk through that, that means we need to be looking at the character of God. We've got to become conversant with it. And again, this is not necessarily getting a PhD in theology. This is spend some time this week thinking about that. So how do you do this? You could search for Bible passages on characteristics of God. You could search for passages on God's holiness and spend some time this week thinking about holiness. God is holy, and what does that look like? How does that give me hope that I have a holy God who sent Jesus to die? Maybe you take some time this week to think about the fact that he's present everywhere. He's omnipresent. And think about how that gives me hope. So spend some time thinking about that this week. Do a study online. Look up some verses. Perhaps you could take a book or a chapter of the Bible and look through it, highlight stuff. But spend some time studying some Bible doctrine and characteristics of God this week. Last thought, and I'm done. Then I'll pray and we'll transition to communion. Last application. Sort of in keeping, again, in the spirit of Lamentations 5, this sort of communal prayer, I put down, especially if you're struggling with issues of hopelessness this week, I put down, spend some time this week praying together with others who can help encourage you to find hope. Spend some time this week praying together with others who can help encourage you to find hope. So you're not in this alone. Again, I teach high school, and one of the things I find with a lot of teenagers is they have very common problems, but for some reason they think they're in this alone, that nobody has their problem and nobody cares and nobody wants to hear. And of course, that's not true. There are people here, there are people in this room. There's pastoral people here that care for you, that love you, that would meet with you, that would pray with you, that would pray with you on the phone, that would try to encourage you to focus on the character of God in the gospel and try to bring hope to you this week. So spend some time this week, maybe in your small group, perhaps in a few minutes here in the back, perhaps later this week. Spend some time praying together with others that can help give you hope. All right, I'm going to pray. Then after we pray, we'll transition to our time of communion, and we'll explain that, but give me a minute to pray here, and then we'll transition. All right, let's pray.